Welcome to the adventures of self. Conversations with ordinary and extraordinary people as they explore what it means to be self-expressed. Come on in. Join the adventure. Welcome, Agamemnon Otero, to the Adventures of Self. It's wonderful to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking time out of your, I know, very busy schedule to be here with us today. And I want to start. I was just thinking about this beforehand, just with your name, right? I know we've had this discussion before because it's going to come across. It's like, wow, he has a guest named Agamemnon. That's an unusual name, and it is an unusual name. And I always like to hear the story because I think it's a good introduction to who you are as a person, and we'll take it from there.
Oh, geez. Well, yeah. I mean, I can't take credit for my name. It was posited in my dad's story. My mother and my father were sort of unlikely bedfellows, but they really they found a love of diving, and their love story was quite amazing in the sense that she was teaching English as a second language in New York City, and my father had been orphaned twice, given up for adoption twice when he was a little kid, and then had just sort of worked in the streets, and then actually found diving as a young man in his early teens, and dove and found different ships and galleons under the water and pull salvage metal off of them, and he had made some discoveries which he couldn't talk about because they weren't gold or diamonds, but they were like heavy metals and deposits inside of some big ships, and he didn't have the resources to take them out. But he eventually found a way. El Nino would come every 7 years and pull back meters and tens of meters of sand, and certain ships would be exposed, and only certain divers know where they are. And he found one ship which seemed to have a large amount of lead ballast in it, but didn't have the resources to take it out, and so he had to wait another 7 years to take it out. And when he finally did, it turned out when it melted it down that it had heavy levels of cadmium in the lead, and with that money he was able to find his mom, get her a house, and take him and his best mate to New York City, where my mother was teaching English as a second language, and he got a job as a superintendent, fixing up the buildings, and he gave her a cut on the rent, and she taught him English. And I think she went to Paris and on her own as like a romantic trip, and then she came back. She knew that she wanted to be with him, and so they started together. And the long story is basically they went to Europe as on a trip to England, and this amazing thing was that she didn't think she could have children, and they were staying with a friend in Barnes, and they were traveling through to Holland, and then she said, "Oh, I'm pregnant," after they were there for a month and traveling in Europe, and my dad was like, "Oh, that's great. Well, let's have the child in South America. If it's a boy, can I name him? If it's a girl, you can name him." She said yes. So they went back to Uruguay, where he had learned to dive, and they were sitting each day right on the water there, and apparently I would kick in my mom's belly until she would go and get into the water, and my dad would say every few months, he said, "Oh, if it's a boy, can I name him?" She said, yeah. He didn't say anything about what the name was. And then when I was born, in Cantagrill in Punta del Este, and I came out, and my mom says, they said, what is it? And he said, it's a boy. And my dad was like, I will name him Agamemnon. And my mother says, does he have long fingers? I want him to play the piano. And the nurse was like, you can't name your son Agamemnon. That, King of Kings, he was killed in a bathtub. And he's like, no, I found the HMS Agamemnon, one of Lord Nelson's ship, which was built in Barnes. And I will name my son this. You will write it on that piece of paper. And they had this battle in my mind around naming me Agamemnon. And it went over, it was like a big kerfuffle in the space. And the woman in bed next to my mom ended up, she's like, sort of searching for a Greek name that she could name her son. And I actually met him 18 years later, except his name wasn't Agamemnon, but that's another story. But I saw him, and he was an amazing thing. But my dad had the rights, and my mom would have named me Elisa after his mother. But yeah, that's the story of my name.
Yeah, cool. Thanks for that. And the reason I think I decided I wanted to start with that, because it tells of a tale that has these sort of twists and turns. It's almost like larger than life, sunken ships and travel to New York and Uruguay and Europe. And I actually didn't know or don't remember the Europe part of the story. But I think the reason I brought that up is because it's a very good introduction to what I know about you, and your adventurous, traveling, sort of almost swashbuckling self, right? We've been friends for I don't know, about 10 years, and have worked together. And when we started working together, I mean, we knew each other as friends, but we started working together on about, I don't know, 10 years ago. We were working together on community-owned solar projects, which were like nobody was doing them at the time. So just tell me, I mean, yeah, kind of like what got you involved in community solar?
Well, the impetus was, I remember it was 12 years ago, or almost 11 and a half, when we were both studying architecture for advanced environment and energy studies in the Center for Alternative Technology. And we were both looking for solutions around how we could rethink life. We'd had experiences and worked in jobs, but we wanted to rethink like sustainability. So I think one of my real desires was to come up with a system which would transform consumers into prosumers. People would be proactively consuming as opposed to passively being consuming. Sort of trying to figure out ways to enable people to take responsibility and ownership of their own destiny, as opposed to the situation which I found myself in, whereas when I'd wake up in the morning and I would turn on the light, I wouldn't think about where the energy came from. I'd turn on the faucet, I wouldn't think about where that water came from. I would buy my groceries from the market, but I wouldn't know where they would come from, or which farm, or who packaged them, or the transmission of that, and all the things that happened along the way. So I was really driven to understand the sort of foundation elements of all of what current systems in cities like we've lived in, New York, London, and yeah, so that's what drove me to be there. But when I got into CAT and the Center for Alternative Technology, and when we were starting to work together, it's very specifically around living in Brixton and seeing people in fuel poverty, and seeing young people who were not interested in anything in the environment and very angry, and finding that I could put solar panels on my house, and I did. I had my own garden, and then I put it at the top of the road. I made a community garden, and like there was no sense of community in the city. I didn't find that, and a lot of people said the same thing. So I wanted to figure out a way of having a sense of community, and the only way to do that was to develop will. Like, people felt that they could do something, that they were empowered to do something, and the only way to do that was to offer an opportunity for co-creation, and and the fundamentals, as you know, of co-creation is like co-ownership. So by allowing everybody in, I mean, to a £1 1 share cooperative, and coming up with the ideas and co-producing those ideas, and having a system, an iterative system, where every year you'd say, well, what do you think we need in this community this year? Let's do that. And then it could be delivered, and it was jointly funded by all those people. That was exciting, and that's what drove me and you and so many of the other amazing people we worked with to come up with solutions. And we didn't know what we were doing, really. There was, like you say, there was no leases on social housing for inner city community energy co-ops. We worked tirelessly to come up with 100-page documents from Simmons and Simmons. The council had no idea what to do with it. They didn't know where to put us, and we just sort of banged our head against the wall for year in and year out for, like you say, 10 years. And now it's getting traction. There's movies coming out about things, and interesting people talking about community energy. But, there was a hell of a lot of sweat and tears and blood that went into those projects that you and I worked on.
And I think what's interesting is like what I picked up on. You speak about, like, we live in big cities, like so many of us, like London, York, wherever, these big cities, and there is this like palpable loss of community. I live in an apartment building, and I know a couple of my neighbors, but we're kind of separate, and I think a lot of people I speak to recognize that we're not. It's kind of like dwindled away, right? Our sense of community. We've moved around so much. You and I both grew up in the U.S., and yet we find ourselves here in London. So obviously we don't have direct family here with us, and friends can be miles away or hours away, and it can be hard to travel across town just to see friends, and let alone connect with the people that are next door to us. And there is this, the more and more that's happened, there is this sense of like alienation, right? And I think it is really interesting, this disconnect that's developed over, I don't know how long, last 50, 100 years, of this disconnect of where things come from, right? That is interesting. You talk about like prosumer and actually being involved, that active involvement, right? Because so much of consumer, right, it's just passive. I buy this, let me get it on Amazon, let me go to the shop, IKEA, or whatever it is, right? Not to pick on them, because it's a system. And you speak about it like from that anger that like youth and that can happen, particularly for people in more economic hardship. Like, not only do they not know about where things come from, but that's true across the whole spectrum of socioeconomics. Like, they're pinched, right? So when water prices rise, or electricity prices rise, or food prices rise, they just have to deal with it. And what I like is that it's not about, it's like, how do you create solutions for that are not about just making money, but actually the whole solution.
People ask me now what I do, and I, for years, said structuring well-being, because I studied math, medicine, and architecture. But really, now I don't know how much we can change, but what you can do is you can live and lead by example. You can be present in yourself, and the people who feel that story, hear that story, and I feel the willpower. It's almost like the greatest gift you can give somebody is like making with them, because then they will go on to make. They can sort of sense that you've created, and then they can create it. That's when we look at those young people who are angry. It wasn't just young people who are angry. I mean, right now in this whole COVID thing, you have the highest amounts of suicide, and so many, they're calling it lock-in. So many men above the age of 50 are committing suicide or on the edge. So many young people feel estranged, and that's really that's really just building on what I don't think the problem of the 21st century was
You mean
over
the 20th?
of the 20th century was, well, I mean, I don't think that, definitely in my lifetime, in the last, I'm 43, so since the turn of the century, I have not seen that it was the lack of religious fiber that has created this. It wasn't overpopulation. It wasn't consumerism. It was literally the loss of a sense of connection to not just your immediate genetic family, but to your non-immediate, to your general family. So you pointed out that you and I live in America and grew up in America and then live in the UK, but we have built there. We have a system that we tap into. I have people who are like mothers, who are like fathers, who are like brothers and sisters, who are like cousins, and I have a network of an incredible guides, and you could call them mentors, you could call them aunties, you could call them dads, and I think that's what's really being lost. We all like so many people like, oh, I went to a therapist, I went to a workshop where we were, a men's circle, all these things. That used to happen with your community. And I'm not saying that men's circle isn't your community. It's becoming your community. But effectively, I think the real loss in the 20th century and the 21st century, like what we've had in the last 20 years, is this connection to your the wider, the sort of human existence of family. Like, I have a genetic mother and father. I have a genetic grandparents. I have no siblings, but we all have a non-genetic relating of mother, of sibling, of father, of grandparent. And I think that's all these community projects that you and I were working on for so many years was, for me. I was looking for the matriarch of an estate. I was looking for that clear mother figure of the estate, and they had to be above 40. They had to have some kids. Usually they were grandparents or grandmothers already, and they knew it. They treated the estate like it was their family, and they existed on every estate we worked on. And I would go as far as say the success that we had on every one of them was because we tapped into the mother, and then she had sisters, and then they had children. Now they weren't their biological sisters, and they were not their biological children, but they had, in essence, a family that lived in those 15 estate high-rises or 20 buildings. Whether it was Mary Simpson or Anne Kenai or Lila Fortunato, there was always someone. And then when I translated that into the gardening projects, when you worked with Energy Garden and we started working across communities, it was the same thing. You had these, the beekeeper was in Bronze Bay Park. This woman, Sheila Malloy, she was the mother of that whole 3 streets. And her family, she was a 3rd generation beekeeper. She had worked for all different people in her life. But it was that matriarch. So it's that connection. And it's all these, we can literally build a business case for reconnection and love. And we can, and that's all you and I were doing. There were lease agreements, and they were documents which enabled the resource, which lives in every community, to deliver a connective substrate where everybody could dig into their non-ancestral connections, their sort of the human experience, mother, father, brother, sister, family.
Yeah, I remember that when you, because I was a bit sort of more tangential, but you were really, and have been throughout this whole period, like say last 10, 12 years, on the ground. And I remember as a board and as discussions we would go to these estates in Brixton and knock on doors and try to talk to people about what we were looking to do, and having that prosumer attitude of, well, we're bringing solar panels on your roof. The community is going to invest in them. We want you to invest in them. this is actually going to benefit you. The energy that we're going to generate on your roofs is going to go. I mean, in the beginning, it was modest in a sense, but it was symbolic, right? It's like it's going to cover your communal lights. It's going to cover your elevators and other things that make at least a little small difference. And we were hitting our heads up against the wall because people, they're just skeptical. They're like, okay, cool, that's nice. And like, we're fortunate, right? We're born, educated in America, and coming to estates with people that are impoverished, culturally, societally, through generations. They have a skepticism of the kind of well-meaning, sort of liberal, sort of bourgeois, kind of middle class people kind of try to come in and say, well, we'll tell you how to run your community. And I remember, like, when you connected with these kind of symbolic mothers or grandmothers of an estate, that when you could connect to them on an individual level and really talk about not just, hey, we want to come in, put some money in, invest, and then walk away and have a nice plaque on a wall that we can say, we're here to help, we want to be part of or help facilitate community and combine, the skills of, yes, it's helpful to have investment, but really, one of the things that really stands out for me about the structure of the solar projects that we worked on, the Brixton Energies, Bannister House, all the ones that we did in the beginning, and is that we made it a fundamental aspect of the organization that 20% of profits go back into the community, right? And nothing against other community-owned organizations or solar projects, but the vast majority of them, even the ones that focus on community, they take profits and give it back to investors, and they encourage those investors to be local. But that there are community energy fund that we set aside. It was like, no, and this is a fund that we are creating for these people to decide what to do. It's not, we can help, we can provide contacts, but these people live here. We're creating community fund. We're borrowing their land, their space, their opportunities, and to give back to them. And that goes back to your sense about, like, creating with them and giving people an opportunity for empowerment, for choice.
Yeah, I mean, co-production is, I guess it's the top of the ladder. If coercion is at the bottom, you have fiduciary responsibility is a legal mandate on global economic movement. If you have a company limited by guarantee, or a private company or a public company, either way with shareholders, the shareholder can hold you to account. And the only thing that they can hold you to legally accountable is that you return the highest amount of money in the shortest amount of time. And unless you change your strategy, and that's approved by your shareholders, to expend a certain amount of your profit on making sustainability a reality, and that's approved, then you will never see a shift towards a more socially just world, or a more environmentally sound system for delivering whatever products there are. And I spend so much time in the youth training programs. We teach them finance, IT, technical, legal, media, and marketing of setting up and running a community energy project. Not because I expect them to set up community projects or renewable energy co-ops or Brixton Energy Solar 50. I expect them to understand that every business has one of those elements: finance, technical, legal, media, marketing, and that when they understand that, they understand they can run a restaurant, or start an energy business, or a clothing company, or whatever they're going to do. That they have the tools they need, and it's not an opaque system, to be able to proactively decide what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And that the opportunity of a community benefit society is that they can co-produce, that you can actually literally bind into the fabric of the organization co-production, and not just internally. I mean, there are plenty of for-profit organizations who are trying to make the world a better place. And I've stopped using the word not-for-profit, and now I say for purpose. So I like to think that we're a for-purpose organization now, that our purpose is to really create resilient cities. I mean, that's really the division between, Brixton was to build the model. Repowering was try to take that model around energy efficiency and fuel poverty farther. And Energy Garden has really been, how do you really think about sustainability? A business model for whole cities, a whole network. I'm not looking at, one regional location or one sort of small estate or even one building. I'm looking at how do you work with the district network operator, the sort of people who run the wires, the transport infrastructure, the healthcare infrastructure. So working with NHS, working with UK Power Networks, working with TfL, and then working with the Port of London Authority. You have these major network providers, and working directly with them, you can actually have, we have a systemic problem, then you can come up with a systemic solution. And if we think the real systemic problem is the breakdown of community, then how do you facilitate that? You need to address the issue of, we have a misconception of what family is and what self is, and then we have a viable company structure that can help resolve some of those issues and give people an opportunity to be whatever they want to be, and that it's inclusive to anyone.
Yeah, and you mentioned for purpose, right? Which is beautiful as a concept, and also, just to say for listeners, to clarify, like the structures we set up do provide and do allow for a return on investment. We're not sort of we're not trying to create something that destroys that system, but it's that holistic sense of, well, what does it mean, right? Like you say, like for purpose, or profit beyond monetary financial profit, social profit, community profit, environmental profit, right? And I think that is a really important aspect of like the structure that we worked on, and you're right. It's so funny that like when we first got started, and I think a number of projects that I've worked on throughout my life in different fields has been, well, nobody really had a model, so we'll just make one up, not kind of out of nowhere, right? Because it comes from the sitting down with a particular council, and when we first sat down with Lambeth Council, talking to somebody about getting a 20-year or 25-year lease on a building, they just said, well, we've never done that. That can't be done. And it was like, well, why can't it be done? And your work and others have really like getting in. It's like, well, what really is the issue? Talking to counselors about what was happening, and then it was like, oh, turns out it can be done. You can actually provide a much longer lease than you ever imagined possible. It just takes an understanding and a willingness.
Yeah.
And I want to get into, because you mentioned Energy Garden, and it's really interesting because like we can talk about sort of the the sort of our humble beginnings of the Brixton Energy projects, and I think you and I are both really proud of them, and what they've done, and hopefully they've inspired other projects, and but they've been relatively modest. They're very localized, and they do take a lot of time. They provide, it is about doing things, one brick at a time or one project at a time, and that's really important. And like I know you and I had a lot of discussions around this because I came from bigger corporate and very large scale renewable energy projects, and it was like, okay, but how do we do this on a larger scale? Because how do we expand this out? And interestingly, it wasn't even it wasn't even like you set out to create Energy Garden as such. It actually started something very radically different, but it has become this major step change. You know, we were doing projects of whatever 50, 100 kilowatts on the Brixton Energies, and now you and I are looking at projects that are megawatts, 1,000 times more or whatever, and expanding that out, across networks like Transport for London and other big operators you're talking about, the UKPNs and rail systems and others that, and again, I mean, like when we first started having conversations with those people, they just said, no, it's not possible. And then it's over time, your and the organizations, like, it's about having a vision and people and bringing people into that vision. I'm really curious to hear, like, how, because you have kind of gone from you were talking about this, like, there's community, and then there's this larger sense of the what it means to be, community, how we build community on a larger, like, it scales, right? There's the community of Greater London, 8 million people, and then there's an estate with 400 people on it. There's a block, a city block with 50 people on it, or whatever it is, right? And all those make up that larger community. And so, just curious how that progression, came about, because like as we were saying, like you're focused now on much bigger systemic issues and able to talk to the likes of Transport for London and Network Rail and others to start to create these bigger solutions.
2011, and you talk about door knocking, and the first thing is that it doesn't matter where people are in the world. Every single person, whether they're poor, it's actually the only people I've met who do not believe that anthropogenic climate change is a reality, are middle class, upper people who are just trying to do a little bit of denial about it or whatever. If this global weather patterns have changed for years. People who were living on these estates never questioned for 1 second that. They were just saying if it's a question around heating or eating, I'm going to keep it at the best temperature I can. Of course I want to have the best price, but I would prefer to have it for the renewable stuff. That sounds great. I'd love to make solar panels. I'd love to learn how to do that. And so there was never a question around, regardless of the education or where people came from, around the reality that we have a wasteful system and that anthropogenic climate change is a reality. So that's first of all I think the base. And the second thing was, you remember that there was a lot of resistance to survey people, like to ask questions. What are we going to do with the data? How do we know that the data is worth capturing? And I have been really strict on collecting data from Brixton days all the way till today, and where I have like 3 people working from different universities, and there's a full-time person who does metrics on what is actually the theory of change, and what we can clearly demonstrate has been an effect of the delivery of the programs. And it was asking those questions initially in 2011 where we saw that people wanted change. They just didn't feel that they could. So how do you empower people was one thing, but the next thing was, how do you then show that they have been empowered to people who want that? So I would never say, I don't care what side of the fence you're on, party, political wise, but I can say that politicians and governments need to see something that supports evidence that change needs to happen. Now, you can compile, 99% of all of the evidence shows that it's anthropogenic climate change is a reality, right? Okay, Is there 99% evidence that shows that you should have community energy on your rooftop? No. That it improves young people's sense of purpose and sense of community, which saves the NHS hundreds of thousands of pounds a year? No. Is there any documentation that shows that people who are that have a sense of community spend less money or have an improved sense of life or vote more? No. You need to get that data by asking people and doing all that. So once that journey started and you started asking those questions, you could go to people like Bank of America, Pioneer Point, Patagonia, TfL, Network Rail, different local authorities, and say, look, we've got a small set of data numbers. You know, we've interviewed 590 people on the overground, and over 80% of them say people that they would like they prefer green spaces on the overground, and the gardens that didn't have spaces that didn't have gardens, those people wanted it more than the people who had green at their station, right? Young BAME, Black, Asian, minority, ethnic communities who I've been surveying for the last 4 years, very specifically on the same program each time we run it. You know, can you demonstrably show that they have had a positive interaction, which then has placed them into employment or into a change of environment, which increases their likelihood for contentment? Yes, because we have that data. And then having that, you can then go to the systems provider, because we solved a lot of the initial problems that we thought we were facing on Elmore House in Brixton, in Loughborough. And, you know, as soon as we had some demonstrable data, we could say to the council, you know, let's do this again. But there was only a certain amount of spaces where we could do it. When you then look and say, this is a systemic problem, there's a policy piece here that can be directly addressed. If you're doing that, then you should really be thinking about it across the system. So don't go to Lambeth Council again to ask for another estate. Go to Lambeth Council and say, I want to do it for the whole borough. You know, you're spending 100 million on energy across the borough, like all these 330,000 people. So let's really think about a program for the whole borough. And then, from my perspective, I really feel like global population is now at 56% living in cities. The majority, you know, they take up less than 3% of the built environment in the world, cities, right? But they are housing 56% of the world population. So you talk about, oh, the Amazon's being cut down, we got to do something. Look at these, you know, every orangutan photograph in a sea of sawn trees. And actually that is just feeding our consumptive behavior. It's not because there's terraced houses with people in them. It's just these spaces are being consumed. So you have a system that is faulty. Then you have people who run that system, but they need data to be able to do that. So our community projects were pilots, and the transition for me into why I shifted gears is that I feel there's a sense of urgency now that we can't all have our 2 acres in the countryside, and we can't have this consumptive behavior. We need to be thinking about what type of purpose we have in our lives, and then directly delivering that. And when doing so, it needs to be constructively assessed and then shown to the operators of the system, which in many cases are politicians, both local and national. And now in a globalized system, it's corporations. So cities have the majority of the financial, 39% of the UK's GDP comes out of London. So and companies like Nike and Adidas, and they have Amazon, they have hundreds of thousands of employees. They act like these cities. So in a sense, they can drive the whole entire sector in one direction or another. So by getting demonstrable facts, you can share it with these guys. And instead of just doing another housing estate, which is fantastic, and there might be 63 flats or 600 flats, you can talk about assessing a city where there's effectively 9 million inhabitants within 1.5 million homes which are broken into pieces. It's like, so let's say about 4 million residences, and you can directly impact those. So that was the phase shift. It was like I needed to shift gears because there was no point. We built the model, it worked. We knew the problems are, we just needed demonstrable information to then share it with those who were empowered, because they all knew, just like inner city people who maybe have come from different countries still knew that anthropogenic climate change was a reality. People in seats of power, whether in the Houses of Parliament or in the EU, said they knew that the systemic issue was people were losing interest not only in what they consume food-wise, whatever, but also even in trying to vote. And so they needed to get people to become more active. And so if you said, look, I have a substrate which encourages this connectivity, then it can be a potential vehicle for that. So that's the reason why I shifted upwards and into creating a systems, sort of a resilience system for cities, because I don't feel we have the time to mess around anymore.
Yeah, and you're talking about sort of the decision makers, and initially spoke about politicians, and I kind of wanted to butt in and say, well, I think there are other decision makers, and you I think correctly said, well, there's corporations, right? Corporations, yes, politicians can make policy and law, but really, I think people understand that what's driving, it goes back to what you were talking about, that sort of fiduciary duty to shareholders, right? That like that sort of short-term and infinite understanding of growth and return on investment doesn't square with a cyclical, resource-bound system that we live in. But the big challenge that we have faced, and I think community energy or community projects in general has faced, is that you end up kind of, it's like you're preaching to the converted in a way. Okay, you get some estates on, but the vast majority of people that invested in our projects, and super grateful for them. It's like I can't say enough, and we led the way, and they led the way with their wallets. But it's kind of people who are already there in that, and we kind of knew that it was the corporations, the deeper pockets, because it's wonderful to get £100 or £1,000 or 10,000 or 100,000 pounds from an individual, but like certainly the co-op or the co-op structure, investment structure here in the UK limits how much an individual can put into one co-op investment, right? And so you'd have to get, you got to get 10, 100,000 investors to get to even, to get to $1 million. And we're talking about looking at raising 10, 15, maybe 100 million or more, right, for that systemic work. And that has been, we've been really working at bringing in or combining, like not even bringing over to our side, to use that, like, it's not like it's sides, but not like convincing somebody to like abandon. Well, we're not talking about abandoning their way of doing things and just being, like, give us some money to play with and you'll feel better about yourself. It's not that greenwashing kind of feel good. It's like, look, and it goes to that sense of co-production, co-creation, right? When we're talking to really large investment funds and vehicles now, it's about combining. It's like, well, let's co-create a structure that allows for community investment, that allows for all these community outcomes and the for purpose, and it has, it combines in a return on investment, a typical financial investment to that. Yeah, and like, that's still very much an ongoing, it's sort of like a work in progress, right? We're still looking at it, but I think it's interesting you talk about like all the data that's been provided, and how that it's part of the story, but it's like you've got demonstrable information that guides people. Because some of this is about you have a vision, we have a vision for Energy Garden or resilient cities, and it's as much about how you co-opt people into that vision, not for the sake of being right, but actually for the sake of bringing their energy in. One of the things we've noticed and been aware of, obviously, corporate organizations have immense efficiency and resources, and when we can tap into them, that's a really valuable thing, and it's as much about getting them on to an idea of how they can start to leverage what they have besides just here's some cash, for instance, and here's our expectation of a return, but how they can have a say in what this starts to look like. And that's a combination of policymakers, the sort of these sort of quasi corporate regulated organizations like the Transport for London and UKPN and Network Rail, with the deeper pockets of institutional investors, and just want to switch to what I've kind of lost count of how many gardens Energy Garden has now on the sort of London rail system, and so just maybe talk through kind of how that's grown and developed, because it started from one project and has really mushroomed out from there, and also I'd just like to hear about how the challenges of these individual projects, because one of the things that I've noticed from being involved in certain community and co-op organizations is, unless there's somebody, one or two or several people driving, really spearheading the work and the coordination, all the well-meaning of an organization can fall away very quickly within 6 months or a year or whatever it is. It's just kind of it seems to be a sort of an endemic issue that comes up with community projects.
It was 2009, 10, and I was on a Dithna Street where I rebuilt this house and had community gardens where Edible Bus Stop started, and we were talking about making the cooperative group, and this guy must have been in his late 70s, maybe early 80s, and he was like, so we should write into this that you can only be the chair for 5 years, and I was like, I had put in tons of time into it. I'd put my own money in. I put £600-700 into this and setting up this community garden, and I was really loving it. And there was tons of people getting involved. And I just, while it was still community, there was still a part of me that wanted to make sure that it would be okay. And he didn't even. I was responding to him as a person, and he was responding to the group as a grandfather. And he said, there is a tendency to put on the ring, and every single time, 3 to 5 years, and you become Gollum, and that moment you whisper precious, and all of a sudden you stop hearing, and the co-production stops, and I would even say that I didn't hear it as well as I hear it now. But the words stuck in my mind, and it was my first real insight into someone who had, because I grew up on communities and co-ops, but I wasn't aware of the sort of governance structures of them as a kid. And there I was, sort of, I must have been early 30s, constructing this cooperative, and then just seeing how it was very similar. The community gardening cooperative is very similar than a community energy one, and sometimes it's even the same people, or the same type of people. You know, you have someone who's into finance, someone who's into governance, someone's into this, just get their hands dirty, you know, there's all sorts of things. But in every project, there is a timeline. It's particularly about the fact that you're not getting paid. And even if there is some people who get paid, they leave too. There's sort of like a life cycle. And so I saw that over and over again. So as I started to develop these community projects for Energy Garden, I realized that it was slightly different than the energy co-ops. The energy co-ops, we might meet like once a month on a Monday. And then as the project got hotter and we got closer to lease agreements and signing and things, it started to be every fortnightly, and then it was every week. That we'd have a meeting at the pub, and it was cool. And then we'd get it in, it was done, and then we had a couple meetings, and then it was really an annual general meeting. So, you know, we could probably say that Brixton Energy Solar 1, we met about, I don't know, 25, 30 times in the first year, and then once a year since. Whereas I built a 14-stage engagement program for these community gardens because I realized there was feedback mechanisms. It was almost like a flow chart. If this, then that. If this, go back to beginning. If this, then that. If it flows this way or that way. And because people come in and out of communities, literally they move in and they move out, and their needs change as well. Like sometimes you need, you know, sometimes people needed to have insulation in their homes, and because they were cold, and then all of a sudden they got the insulation, and then they needed airflow, so they needed circulation, but not of cold air, right? So that's a very physical change that we did in social housing. But in community gardens, and the needs of a community, you know, let's say gentrification sweeps in, there goes from being less of a need to provide a certain type of a vegetable or a certain type of space, or it's much more esoteric why people are there. Some people in some areas are growing food to eat, whereas other people are growing flowers because it's nice. And even further, there's groups that come in and they have those things, and they're the same group, and they've transformed over years. So you need to have a malleable structure for those to happen. And so it really is about a governance framework. And I always go back to Elinor Ostrom's work around governing the commons. Her Nobel work, which was basically a 40-year study, which she built on top of her husband's research, which is some 20-odd, 30 years on top of that, was around how the people who live in a place should govern it. And that they should. So in a fishery, for instance, if they're on rotation and everybody is impacted by everybody else, there's a great deal more respect to that environment. And so too is that in the urban ecology. And the biome that we have, whether we think of cities as having a biome or not, is irrelevant. It has one, and it has an ecosystem. And so when you engage local people into that, and there are 34 energy gardens in London, and there are about 140 community groups that work across those. And there are, at any one time during the week, there's probably 150 volunteers who are engaged. So I've had to change it up. Like you say, in 2000, it was July 8th, 2012, and it was Bronsbury Park. And I began, I remember ripping up black plastic with the station manager. And there was syringes, there was knives, there was waste bags and plastic plates and all sorts of things. And the transition took many, many years, and we'd have influxes of excited people, 10, 15, they peaked at around 14 people who were regularly engaged once or twice a week. And we even went down, and we lost tons of people. It went down to 3, I think, for a little while. And now it's back up to like 8. But it grew. It went to Hampstead Heath, it went to Finchley Central, and Hackney Downs, and down around Bromley and Brockley, and you know, all these different places. And each one was different, and each one was encouraged to be different. Some had beehives, some had bat huts, some had, you know, they were really pushing the biodiversity. Some had vegetables, some had flowers. And from my perspective, it was only important that it was co-produced, that they knew that they had someone who would deal with the legal issues of being on major transportation network with high voltage, that you know, the sites would be assessed, and the lease agreements would be looked at, and infrastructure due diligence was carried out, procurement processes were in place, and then people could just get down and dirty with the plants that they want to plant and the things that they want to do. And so having an engagement process like that has been such a constructive way of sizing up, because we would have never been able to do the work if we had carried on the way we were doing it in Brixton or how we were doing it in repowering. There's no way to engage 150 volunteers at one time, and across multiple sites. And yet by using the transport network and thinking of it as a whole, as one network, and then having everybody following the same process and then addressing the issues in a specific way, then you can have a fewer amount of engagement officers and a technical team which centralizes the work, and a legal team which centralizes the work. You can actually deliver a system that has the ability to scale and change and has the space for people to grow. I don't want them to be solar panel installers or to grow potatoes necessarily. That's great if they do, but I want them to be able to have that space to be able to do that. And to do that, you need to have a system which has feedback mechanisms and loops so that we can have all of the different processes. It's like a limnoscape, the energy flowing in and going back and forth, and then it finally makes its way out, and that brings into the sea of new ideas, which then can transpire up into the environment again, and then bring back new raindrops and ideas that flow through that gravitational pull through the limnoscape down to the sort of flow of a never-ending sea of ideas.
Yeah, beautiful. Cool. I know you've got to go, so we're kind of just about out of time. I know you've got a meeting to go to. Is there anything that, I think it's like throughout all this, I guess I just want to end on a bit of a grand sort of inspiring note. It's like, what's kind of, because I know, like, you know, we've been friends and been on the board, and there have been lots of challenges along the way. We have hit many times where it's like, ooh, might not get through this one, this organization, this contract, or whatever it is. And yet, you know, you're still banging away, and not for, but I don't mean that in a flippant sort of like banging your head against the wall, because, like, you know, the momentum that you and the organization, everybody involved in it, has created, right? It's like, it's palpable, right? And like, you know, we're really starting to see, like, the investments and the money that's coming in, the people that are coming in, the connections that you have, that we're making. I don't know, like, what's kind of kept you going throughout all this?
I try to drink hot water to keep my digestion good. I wake up and am kind to myself. I will watch a couple videos and check my WhatsApp when I work as much as I can, and then I turn off and I protect my space. I have clear boundaries between what I can do and what I can't do, and really clear with people who take more than they give. And, you know, like, my biggest obstacle right now is recognizing that the global financial systems don't want to have an assessment tool for environmental social governance in assessment. So, you know, they're talking about how global financial economics systems around the world, they have about 1% is 350 billion, is supposedly going to support socially sound, just transition programs that are environmental, and it's just not making its way down to where we are. And it's one of the biggest roadblocks that I've come to, and I've literally, as you know, have built a board of chief execs and of industry moguls and leaders to come up with a vehicle for that. And this is a trial and a tribulation, which is just like any one of the ones, whether it was in the first days of Brixton, where we had, like, Carolyn Dwyer, who was head of the Regen, who was like, you know, I think you guys are trying to make money off of these people. She was trying to protect Lambeth Council from some upstart entrepreneurs. She just didn't realize that we were social entrepreneurs delivering social good and a reasonable return. 4% return to investors isn't going to make us wealthy, and you can see by our incomes that it never was. But this is the same thing. Big corporates, organizations are delivering their returns to their shareholders, and they are not willing to stop what they're doing just because a few upstarts with entrepreneurs are trying to come up with something that asks them to change the way they do things. So I have been thwarted many times in some great idea that has been thought up in a glass tower, or even our green glass tower that looks down upon the plebs. The reality is that until you get into the nitty gritty, until you get into the weeds and start to work through it, both with the people that are suffering firsthand, but also secondary players in that, like corporates, like city politicians. When you get all of them together and you come up with a solution, you can do that. And that's really, I feel like I have a connection to my own purpose. And I didn't really feel like I hit that until I was 40. I feel like everything has just been fumbling around in a bathtub. From relationships to colleagues and business partners to even my emotional relationships. I think like there's a sense that I have a real sense of purpose, and it isn't about delivering a community energy project or a gardening project, or even changing the energy market reform bill like we did, but very specifically, I have a connection and a real responsibility to improve that relationship between people, to help support a substrate where people can enjoy that sense of community again. And being connected to my sense of purpose like that gives me the ability to rise each morning and I don't smile. I'm not trying to be happy. My goal is not happiness. It's about contentment and the sense of purpose and the wealth that I experience at the end of the day. I'm exhausted, but my willpower has been increased because I've looked at what I've made, that I've sweat over, that I've cried over, that I've bled over, and I can see that it was built. Sometimes it took you 8 years, 9 years, 10 years before things happened, but it's just constantly one drip and the bucket fills. And that's what gets me up each day.
Excellent, and long may it continue. And I really want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to come here and spend time with us. And I would love to have you back on at some point, find out what else is going on. And there's so much more that we could talk about. But I really, really want to thank you for your time here today.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you, Taylor. It's been a great opportunity to be able to talk with you in this way. Even the fact that it's on a recording like this, we can really just spend this space and time to reflect over all the things that have been delivered. So, you were so instrumental in building Brixton and repowering and Energy Garden, and as a director, I know I was on the daily sort of front end of going in and on the sort of cold face of it, but it's because of having a group of people, a board of people that when the shit hits the fan, you can stand strong, and when you are broken and you can't stand strong, that you can go to discuss it with your peers, and that is very powerful. And I'm forever thankful and grateful for that time with you.
Yeah, and it's another, just to round it out, that's another aspect of community that we created.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, thank you for this co-creation, this co-production, and see you soon.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you heard, go on, be adventurous. Click the subscribe button. And join us next week for a new adventure. Until then,